The comment came right after dessert. The dining room smelled like cinnamon, roasted turkey, and the pine candles my mother-in-law insisted on lighting every Christmas Eve. Outside, snow pressed softly against the windows, while laughter drifted through the house in small, careful bursts. I was reaching for my wine glass when Eleanor looked at me from across the table and smiled the way people do right before they say something cruel disguised as honesty. "You know," she said lightly, "some women marry into families. Others just visit them for a while." A few nervous chuckles followed. Then she added quietly, almost as an afterthought, "You were never really family, Ava." The room went still. I looked at my husband first. Daniel stared down at his plate, slowly cutting into his ham without saying a word. No defense, no discomfort, nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know. Very carefully, I folded my napkin and placed it beside my untouched dessert plate. The candlelight reflected softly against the silver fork near my hand, while someone in the kitchen poured another glass of wine, pretending not to notice what had just happened. "I think I need some air," I said calmly. No one stopped me. Outside, the cold Connecticut air hit my face sharply as I walked to my car. My hands trembled only once when I closed the driver's door behind me. Then I opened my phone. 30 minutes later, Daniel's company email access was revoked. Our shared accounts were frozen. And the divorce papers my attorney finalized 2 weeks earlier were officially delivered to his mother's front door. For most of our marriage, Daniel and I looked perfect from the outside. We lived in a large colonial house in suburban Connecticut, with white shutters, a carefully decorated front porch, and the kind of neighborhood where everyone waved politely while secretly measuring each other's lives. Every December, our Christmas card sat near the top of everyone's refrigerator, smiling family, matching sweaters, polished happiness. People envied us. Or at least, they envied the version of us we worked very hard to perform. Daniel came from one of those families that treated image like religion. His mother hosted charity luncheons, chaired local committees, and spoke about family values, as if she personally invented them. And Daniel? He was the golden son. Charming, ambitious, too intelligent for ordinary jobs, according to Eleanor. Over the years, he launched 3 different startups. Every single one failed. But somehow, failure never seemed to belong to him. There was always an excuse: bad investors, weak partners, bad timing. And every time another business collapsed, his family rallied around him like he was a misunderstood genius instead of a 46-year-old man burning through money he didn't earn. Because the truth was, I carried us financially for almost the entire marriage. Quietly. I worked in corporate insurance consulting and eventually built a stable executive career, while Daniel chased ideas that never survived beyond 2 years. I paid the mortgage when his companies failed, covered insurance premiums, managed retirement accounts, handled taxes, utilities, school tuition, and every invisible responsibility that kept our lives intact. But none of that mattered to his family. To them, I was still the outsider who married in, the woman who made things comfortable, while Daniel remained the center of attention no matter how much damage he caused. And after enough years around people like that, you start realizing something dangerous. Some families don't want a daughter-in-law. They want an audience for their son. The humiliation never arrived dramatically. That's what made it so difficult to explain to anyone outside the family. It came in tiny moments, small exclusions, quiet dismissals that left no visible bruise but slowly taught you exactly where you stood. Every Thanksgiving, Eleanor insisted on taking family portraits in front of the fireplace. The photographer would arrange everyone carefully while Daniel's brothers joked loudly and their children climbed across the furniture. And somehow, almost every year, there would be at least one accidental version taken without me in it. "Just immediate family first," Eleanor would say casually, waving me aside while adjusting Daniel's collar like he was still 12 years old. Immediate family. As though 19 years of marriage had somehow remained temporary. Then there was Rebecca, Daniel's college girlfriend. Eleanor adored her, always had. Even after Daniel and I married, Rebecca still appeared at holidays, charity events, and summer dinners at Eleanor's house. She would walk in carrying wine bottles and old stories while Eleanor practically glowed beside her. "Rebecca just understands this family," she once said in front of me with a soft, nostalgic smile. I remember sitting there gripping my fork so tightly my fingers hurt, while Daniel laughed uncomfortably and changed the subject instead of defending me. That became his pattern. Minimize, redirect, dismiss. Whenever I tried explaining how isolated I felt, he would sigh like I was exhausting him. "You're reading too much into things, Ava. My mother doesn't mean it that way. You always assume people dislike you." And after enough years, I started questioning my own reality. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe this was simply how families worked. But emotional erosion doesn't happen because of one cruel moment. It happens because someone repeatedly teaches you that your discomfort matters less than everyone else's comfort. And eventually, you stop expecting to be protected at all. Dinner that night felt strangely formal, even before Eleanor spoke. The dining room glowed under soft amber light from the chandelier while Christmas music drifted quietly from the living room speakers. Outside, snow pressed against the windows in thick, silent waves, covering the neighborhood in that polished kind of winter beauty people mistake for peace. The table looked perfect. Too perfect. Gold-rimmed plates, crystal wine glasses, linen napkins folded into careful shapes Eleanor learned from some hosting magazine 20 years earlier. A row of pine-scented candles burned steadily down the center of the table, thin streams of wax slowly sliding toward the silver holders beneath them. I remember noticing ridiculous details that night. The reflection of the chandelier trembling faintly in my fork. The sound of wine pouring into Daniel's glass from across the table. The smell of cloves and rosemary hanging heavily in the air. Because when humiliation arrives quietly, your brain clings to ordinary details just to stay grounded. Eleanor was telling one of her usual stories about Daniel as a child, when Rebecca laughed beside him, touching his arm lightly like she still belonged there. Daniel smiled back automatically, comfortable, familiar. Then Eleanor turned toward me. "Ava always looks so uncomfortable during family dinners," she said lightly, swirling wine in her glass. "I suppose some people never fully settle into families like ours." A few people exchanged awkward glances, but no one interrupted her. And then she said it, calmly, casually. "Some women marry into families, some just stay temporarily." Silence spread instantly across the table. I looked at Daniel. For one terrible second, I truly believed he would say something, defend me, stop her. But instead, he lowered his eyes toward his plate and took another sip of wine. That hurt more than the sentence itself. The surrender. The quiet agreement hidden inside his silence. Across the table, someone cleared their throat softly. Another person reached for mashed potatoes they clearly didn't want. Nobody knew where to look. And sitting there beneath the warm Christmas lights while candle wax dripped slowly beside untouched dessert plates, I realized I had spent 19 years begging for belonging in a room where my absence would always make people more comfortable than my presence ever did. I didn't respond to Eleanor. Not immediately. The silence after her comment stretched across the dining room like something physical, heavy enough to press against my chest. Somewhere near the kitchen, a spoon clinked softly against china before stopping altogether. Daniel still wouldn't look at me. That was the moment something inside me finally went still. Not shattered. Not emotional. Finished. Very carefully, I folded my linen napkin into a neat square and placed it beside my plate. My wine glass remained untouched, a dark red reflection trembling softly beneath the candlelight. "I think I need some air," I said quietly. No one stopped me. Not Daniel. Not Eleanor. Not even Rebecca, who suddenly seemed fascinated by the mashed potatoes on her plate. I stood slowly, smoothed the front of my sweater, and walked toward the front door while Christmas music continued playing faintly behind me. Some old song about home and warmth and family. Outside, the cold hit immediately. Connecticut winters have a sharpness to them that feels personal at night. The snow along the driveway crunched beneath my heels as I walked toward my car, each breath turning white in the dark. Across the street, neighboring houses glowed softly with Christmas lights and decorated trees, looking warm and untouched from the outside. I sat inside my car without turning the engine on. For a few seconds, I simply stared through the windshield while my hands rested against the steering wheel. They were trembling slightly now, not from sadness, from clarity, because for 19 years, I had mistaken endurance for love. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to a contact I had saved 3 weeks earlier after another dinner where Eleanor introduced Rebecca as the daughter she never had. Marianne Keller, family attorney. She answered on the second ring despite it being Christmas Eve. "You were right," I said softly, my voice steadier than I expected. "I'm ready now." There was a brief pause before she replied calmly, "Do you want me to proceed?" I looked back at the glowing house one last time, at the silhouettes moving comfortably behind the windows, a family that had spent years making space for everyone except me. And for the first time in a very long time, I stopped trying to stay where I was never truly wanted. Daniel didn't understand what had happened until 2 days later. That was when the illusion finally cracked. Not emotionally, financially. The first sign came when he tried logging into his company email and found himself locked out of several administrative accounts connected to his latest startup. Then one of his vendors called asking why insurance paperwork hadn't been renewed. By Thursday morning, our shared credit line had been frozen pending separation proceedings. That was when he started panicking. Because for years, Daniel had mistaken invisibility for dependence. He thought that because I handled things quietly, they somehow managed themselves. But they didn't. I did. Every insurance filing tied to his business passed through me first. Every overdue tax notice, every payroll correction, every investor document he forgot to submit on time. I handled all of it behind the scenes while he played entrepreneur in front of people who still believed he was one breakthrough away from success. Even the condo downtown, the one Daniel occasionally joked about turning into his future office space, belonged entirely to me. I had purchased it years earlier through a separate inheritance account before we refinanced the house. His name had never been attached to it. He simply never paid enough attention to notice. That realization hit him hardest during the meeting with our attorneys. I still remember the way he stared at the financial disclosures spread across the conference table, blinking slowly like he was reading a stranger's life instead of his own marriage. "You handled all of this?" he asked quietly. Not angry. Confused. As though the woman he dismissed for years as passive and emotionally weak had suddenly become unrecognizable. But the truth was simpler than that. I had always been carrying him. Emotionally, financially, practically. The difference now was that I had finally stopped protecting him from the consequences of standing on his own. The real consequences began quietly. Not with shouting. Not with dramatic public humiliation. Just small disruptions that slowly exposed how fragile Daniel's world actually was without someone constantly holding it together behind the scenes. A week after Christmas, the electricity at the house was temporarily interrupted because an automatic payment tied to our shared account failed during the separation process. Daniel called me immediately, irritated at first. "Why didn't you warn me?" he asked. I almost laughed. For 19 years, I had been the warning system for everyone around me. The internet service lapsed 2 weeks later because the renewal notices were still connected to my email. Then payroll processing for Daniel's startup stalled after one of his insurance compliance filings expired. Investors began asking questions he didn't know how to answer because he had never handled those systems himself. At first, Eleanor blamed me for everything. "She's trying to punish you," she told him repeatedly. "She's being vindictive." But eventually, even Daniel stopped arguing. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't revenge. It was exposure. For the first time in his life, he was being forced to function without someone quietly fixing problems before they reached him. The hardest part came through our son, Caleb. He was 16 when the separation became official, old enough to understand more than adults realized. One evening after dinner, he stood in the kitchen watching Daniel struggle to assemble paperwork for school insurance forms I used to handle automatically every year. And very softly, almost carefully, Caleb asked him, "Did Mom do everything around here?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He just stared down at the stack of unfinished forms spread across the counter while the kitchen clock ticked behind him. That silence said enough, because karma rarely arrives as dramatic destruction. Sometimes it arrives as reality slowly stripping away every invisible comfort someone took for granted until they're finally forced to see who was carrying their life all along. I met Daniel 3 months later at a small cafe near the river downtown. It was raining outside again, the windows fogged softly from the warmth inside, while quiet jazz played somewhere above the low hum of conversations. He looked older, not dramatically, just tired in a way I had never noticed before. For a few minutes, we talked about the children, schedules, practical things, the kind of conversation people have when intimacy has already died and routine is all that remains. Then Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and finally asked the question I think he'd been carrying for years. "Why didn't you tell me things were this bad?" I looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had spent nearly 2 decades dismissing discomfort the second it inconvenienced him. And very calmly, I answered, "I did." The rain tapped softly against the windows behind him. "You just preferred comfort over listening." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately after that. No argument, no defense. Because deep down, he knew it was true. Some marriages don't end in one terrible moment. They end slowly, every time one person speaks honestly and the other decides it's easier not to hear them.